like most people, Dr. LaHaye's strengths can also be his weaknesses. The very thing that makes him so strong of a Bible expositor and so strong in his faith can make him sound shrill sometimes politically, or people think they have him pegged as a right-wing reactionary conservative, that type of thing. And yet I've seen the soft side of him. I've seen him pray with people. I've seen him lead people to Christ. He's really a soul winner at heart and really a teddy bear. But we have different styles when it comes to the media as well. I remember one time we were on radio in Chicago, and a woman called in and she was telling us we were totally off base and we were unbiblical, and the Bible doesn't really say what we said it said, and she had her own views. And I had my answer all planned out, where I often try to say, well, there are different ways of looking at it, and we're glad we live in a country where we're free to compete in the marketplace of ideas. And Dr. LaHaye just interrupted and said, "Lady, what are you smoking?" I remember talking to some college students one time, and one of them was a little starstruck, and he said, "What's it like to be a full-time freelance writer?" And I said, "It's like having homework every day for the rest of your life." He didn't seem so impressed after that. Then I was telling some kids, I said, I'm old enough that I got my start writing on a manual typewriter. And then I went to an electric typewriter, and then a correcting selectric. I thought that was the living end. Then finally to a memory typewriter, and then to computers, and try to stay on the cutting edge. Then, thinking I was funny, I said, "I'm sure some of you have heard of a typewriter." And a girl raised her hand and she said, "I think I saw one once." I said, "Where? Jurassic Park?" Between Dr. LaHaye and me, we've heard from more than 3,000 people who tell us that they've received Christ through reading Left Behind series. And, that's more important than any bestseller list, any royalty check. And when I say that we've heard from these people personally, it's either phone calls or in person or by email. And it's interesting because we've used this figure 3,000 so often now that people now come up to us and say, "Make me number 3001. We have our favorite stories. One is of a young man in Minnesota. I heard this from bookstore owners. They said a family came in and told them this, that their young son was running with the wrong crowd in high school and falling away from the church, falling away from the Lord. And they gave him Left Behind to read, and they just kept waiting for him to read it. And finally they noticed he had the book. And one day he came to him and told them that they didn't have to worry about him anymore, that he'd read the Left Behind book, and he was going to come back to church and come back to his faith. And he said, "I'm going to buy a box of these books and give them to all my friends that I've been running with, and see if it can have an impact on them." Before he could do that, he was killed in a car wreck. And so at his funeral, his parents bought that box of books, brought them and passed them out to his friends, and several of them came to Christ too. And that's really what it's all about. There's also a story of an elderly man in his 80s who said he read Left Behind, and he said he had to read it through a magnifying glass because his eyes were so bad that he couldn't read otherwise. And he said when he finished reading the book, he knew he needed to receive Christ because he didn't want to be left behind. So he had one of his grown children lead him to Christ. And he said, "It wasn't because of what I saw through the glass. It was because of what I saw through my heart." On that happy note.
That's great.
One of the big surprises to me after the incredible success of the Left Behind series, I mean, the adult series alone has sold nearly 45 million copies, and with the kids series, the total is in the 60 million range, is that nobody seems to know about the prequels. After the first 12 books in the series, we went back and did 3 prequels because people wanted to know where these characters came from and who they were when they started, and where did Rayford come from, and what was Nikolai like as a child, and did he have parents? The Antichrist in our mind is a human being who was born and raised overseas. And so we wrote The Rising, The Regime, and The Rapture. And it's been a real surprise to me when I hear from people at signings today. They'll say, "I've read all the Left Behind books," and I say, "How did you like the prequels?" And they say they weren't really aware of them. And I think maybe the people just thought that the 12th book, Glorious Appearing, was the end, and weren't aware of them. But I think they're special, and some of the book reviews we've got on those have been really something different because they're very much more character-driven than action-oriented. There's a lot of action in them, but just by their very nature, they're character-driven. And so I just hope more and more people find out about the prequels, and then they realize that there are also 2 sequels, so a total of 16 books. But The Rising, The Regime, and The Rapture are the prequels that any fan of the series should enjoy. Yeah, the prequels are really part and parcel of the whole series. They really set it up. We find out that Nikolai was born of a strange union in Romania, and we find out who his mother was and who his father was, and we go all the way back to where Rayford Steele was a little boy, and he's got his first interest in being an aviator, and how he and Irene met in college and fell in love, and how they were married. And so all the characters that you've come to know in the regular series, their beginnings really appear in the prequels. Buck is a college student and talks about how he's estranged from his family, how he becomes a rising star as a journalist, and so it tells all that background, and people who have followed these characters really enjoy going back and finding out about their origins. And one of the interesting aspects too is that the third prequel does not really stop just before Left Behind and then we go on to the Rapture. We actually cover the Rapture in the book called The Rapture, but instead of telling it from the perspective of those left behind, we're telling it from the perspective of those who go. So you see Irene Steele and Ramey Steele actually being transported to heaven, and what it's like to fly through the air and to join the throng of believers who wind up in heaven and then see what heaven's like. And we even talk about many of the great saints of old and even modern day martyrs and heroes of the faith who get their final reward in heaven. And we get a lot of letters from people who've read those that are really moved by those stories. I've written more than 160 books, and I've never seen anybody reading one of my books in public except the Left Behind series, and I see them everywhere. And especially during the heyday of Left Behind, when we were coming out with a couple a year and they were debuting #1 in the New York Times and selling millions of copies. Everywhere I went, I saw somebody reading them, and I always had fun because I would ask them what they were reading. And they'd tell me all about it, and they'd say, have you read these? And I'd say, well, people tell me I look like the guy in the back. So they'd turn the book over and they'd say, you really do look like this guy. And so I'd say, well, it really is me. And more than half the time they'd say, oh, it's so nice to meet you, Dr. LaHaye. I was at a ball game one time and had a copy of Left Behind with me. We often took them with us wherever we went because people would talk about them. They'd see them and say something about them. And some girl found out that I'd written this book, and she said, so what's it about? And I've always been careful. I don't like to say, well, it's a story from the Bible about the rapture of the church and about Jesus coming back. I just say, it's about the end of the world. And people say, oh, it's sci-fi. And I say, well, some people would look at it that way. It's about an event that I think is going to happen someday, just enough to get them interested. She says, so what's it about? I said, it's about the end of the world. She says, what happens? I said, well, a big percentage of the population just disappears right out of the clothes. She goes, where do they go? I said, they go to heaven. She goes, how do you know? I said, I wrote the book.